Hello and welcome to one-on-one show of Urban Update. My name is Abhishek. It is a popular belief that 21st century will be the century of cities. It is also believed that 21st century belongs to Asia, more specifically India. If we look at these beliefs from India's perspective, then India's urbanization becomes an important topic of discussion. Many reports suggest that India is going to witness massive urbanization in coming decades. An urban avalanche is coming. But what data says and how do these prospects of urbanization in India is looking? We will discuss all these pressing issues with Dr. Amitabh Kundu. So before we start our conversation, I would like to introduce Dr. Kundu. He is a renowned economist and social scientist. He was the dean of School of Social Sciences, including as a member of the National Statistical Commission and the National Sample Survey Organization. He has also taught in Germany and Netherlands. He is also a prolific writer and has published over 30 books and 300 plus research papers on topics ranging from urbanization and poverty to migration and regional development. He is senior fellow with WRI and distinguished fellow with RIS for developing countries. Dr. Kundu's expertise in these areas makes him a respectable voice in the ongoing discussion about India's economic and social progress. So without further ado, get right into it and hear what Dr. Kundu has to say on these pressing issues. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kundu.
Abhishek, first, thank you for the slightly inflated introduction. It's an honor and privilege for me to be a part of this one show of Urban Update.
So my first question to you, sir, is that what has been India's urbanization journey over the years, maybe after independence if we look at, and if we compare that urbanization trend in India and Asia and maybe in other developed and developing countries, what is the striking difference you see?
Now, if you look at the global data set brought out by United Nations, that is World Urbanization Prospect, almost regularly it comes out, you would see that India, right from 1950 onwards to 2011, for which we have the data, official data, you find the growth rate of urban population in India has been very low, even among the South Asian countries. In South Asian region, the UN will consider even Iran and Afghanistan that have recorded very high rate of growth in this period that I talked about. The only country which has similar or a slower growth rate is Sri Lanka. Look at Bangladesh, Pakistan, they have much higher rate of urban growth, although it is nothing compared to what Latin America experienced. If you look at some of the Latin American countries, in 1940, many of them had the same level of urbanization, 20, 25, 30% people living in urban areas in, as I said, 1940. But within 5 decades, they have come to the level of 75%, 80%, 85%. Whereas the Asian countries, including India, we have moved from 18% to 32%, some countries to 40%. So certainly, Asian urbanization has been very, very, on the conservative side. Your identification of new census towns have been very, very stingy. And identification of the peripheral areas to be brought in within the urban limits has also been very, very restrictive. These are the factors which really tell us that the growth rate of urban population in many of the Asian countries, particularly I'm talking about India, is on the lower side. And the recommendation from, you talked about, 21st century belonging to Asia and India, and that's from ADB. Even ADB is suggesting that Indian urbanization rate must accelerate to realize the dream of 21st century belonging to India. So our growth rate of urban population has to accelerate in the coming decades.
So do you believe that an urban avalanche is coming to India?
No, not really. Frankly, this is some kind of a myth which has been propagated that the epicenter of urbanization is shifting from north to south Nothing like avalanche, but nonetheless, the growth rate of urban population has been very, very low, partly because the growth being concentrated in a few large cities. Our, imagine 71, 72% of the total urban population lives in class 1 cities. The number of small towns that have emerged in every census is 300, 400 only, excepting in 2011 census where we have 3,000 new towns coming up. So I think the projection that has been taken by Niti Aayog is on the conservative side. It shows that percentage of urban population in India by 2050 will be something 43, 44%, which is, I think, a conservative estimate. The UN says that it will be much higher, and I have done a study for, in a way, indirectly for Niti, which also shows that rate of growth of urban population will accelerate because a large number of potential towns, the big villages which have acquired in a way the urban characteristics, non-agricultural activities, they will be counted in the urban frame, and we will have certainly percentage of urban population by 2050 should be around 50%. That's our projection.
Because you have also taught economics and social sciences in different universities. So how do you look urbanization in India from economic point of view? Why I'm asking this, because after 91, when our economy opened up, but our urbanization, the highest growth rate was in between 71 and 81. That was 3.8, I guess. And after that, our urban growth rate has declined and then became stagnant. What is your point of view, and why that 71 and 81, between 71 and 81, our growth rate accelerated?
You see, the point is 71, 81 growth rate was the highest that we have seen in the present century, even up to 2011. And the estimate for 2021 census is also that it will not be as high as, more than 3.5%. First of all, 1971 census was slightly on the conservative side. So the base was slightly low, and that's why the growth rate became higher. But then, of course, the growth rate came down. There were economic stagnation also. The large cities had problems. But by the way, 2011 census shows a growth rate of 2.7576, and more or less same as 91, 2001. The growth rate of urban population has been more or less stable between 1991 and 2011. But that is, I'll tell you, because 2011 census identified 2,800 new census towns, which is exceptional. Earlier, always we had less than 400 new towns, 300 new towns. 2001 census also had 500 new towns. Suddenly, you add 2,700 new towns. That's why growth rate came up. If there was same number of new towns coming up, our growth rate would have been much less. The 2001, 2011 growth rate would have been 2.5, much below 91, 2001. So I think there is some element of census activism. The number of new towns that were identified, that was not really because of drastic change in the rural economy and many villages coming up. It is also the census activism that, they should identify a little more towns, and that is likely to continue. Many of the villages that have already acquired urban characteristics, like density, like percentage of workers in outside agriculture, size, they will now going to be identified as urban in 2021 census, 31 census. And that's why, I think Niti also believes that the rate of growth of urban population will be much higher than before. And the UN has certainly projected that the growth rate of urban population will speed up, and by 2050, India will be 54% people living in urban areas, whereas the Niti's projection, the government of India's projection, is about 8 or 10% less than that. And I am quite sure that the reality will lie between that, and India will be touching 50% urbanization by 2050.
So my question was also about how this economic situation in a country affect urbanization? Because why I mentioned globalization and economy opening up of economy change the trend of urbanization.
You're right. The rate of economic growth certainly affects urbanization, pace of urbanization. But it is much more than the rate of economic growth, but the what kind of strategy that we have. If our growth strategy is only to get advantage of the global market, then you need the big cities and you need to link up with the global capital market. And that has a problem. Danny Roderick, who talks about premature deindustrialization, says that the developing countries that are dependent on the external market through the large cities are experiencing premature deindustrialization because the global uncertainties gets imported into the developing countries. But I have a feeling that if our growth strategy, as you said, economic growth would impact urbanization, the impact will be much more significant if these cities are networking with the small and medium towns and the settlements around and taking advantage of the local demand, as has been envisaged by Goal 11 of Sustainable Development Goals. They talk about linkages with the settlement, inter-settlement linkages, because your large dependence, heavy dependence on the global capital market and global city system is certainly going to be a risky factor. It may get you into trap of premature deindustrialization and your urban growth rate would suffer. That's why I think the present strategy of the government of India is to have a little bit more spatially balanced urbanization, which can be sustainable.
Now, talking about cities are engines of growth, that is very old and tired cliche statement that said time and again. So, but if if we look at why people come to cities, definitely for a better living condition, economic opportunities. So if we accept these cities are engines of growth, I want a fresh perspective on this. Why do people come to cities and why? Because after pandemic, the situation has changed. People are working from home. They are getting in state like Kerala, urban and rural definition. I mean, it means there is a very blurry line between urban and rural because facilities, medical and education facilities are available in rural areas also. So, what is of your perspective on this? Why do people come to cities? Or it is just the economic and better living condition will remain the factor in the coming decades in India?
Abhishek, I can't agree with you more that one of the most talked about cliches is cities are the engines of growth with a very little empirical evidence. All the empirical evidence that are being quoted to defend that kind of a postulate is that a large percentage of the GDP of the country is coming from few cities. That is simply showing concentration. Engine of growth means they should be leading, they should be linked, they should be able to carry the passenger and the goods traffic. And the engine can go very fast if it can delink itself from the other bogies. It can go very fast, but that's not the purpose. Engine of growth means it should be able to really take the whole regional system along with you. And there are diverse experiences in many countries. The large cities have not performed the role of really regionally integrating and taking it forward. They have been linked to the global market. But if you wanted to have something different from this, it's not a very fresh thing. There are many radical scholars who believe that these cities are not centers of growth, but they're centers of surplus generation and exploitation. Most of the colonial cities did that. It generated surplus and siphoned it to the metropolis. Even today, many of the less developed countries, the cities are performing that role of really taking the resources out of the country. But as I was telling you, that engine should really be cities should be engines of growth by linking up with the regional settlement. And that is extremely important to tap the local demand, because you should not be dependent on the global demand, because that is subject to fluctuation. If you are in a position, India is such a big economy, it is a huge middle class coming up. If you base your urban system on the demand which is coming internally to a large extent. Of course, in the modern times, you have to depend on the global market for technology, for investment, for market. But if your global demand is also a substantial part, then the urbanization model could be sustainable.
So, in the same direction, my another question is that you said that cities should link and take their regions along if when they are developing. So, do our cities have mind of their own? Mind, I mean, because are they able to decide for themselves what kind of development they want, what kind of infrastructure they need and want? Because many a times these decisions are taken at the central level, and that's state, because urban is a state subject, and the state governments decide the course of development. So, do you think any possibility if cities are able to decide for themselves, the situation will be different? Urbanization picture will be different?
Abhishek, I share your concern, particularly when I look at the Indian situation, that the cities have very little autonomy, even if they want to revise. I'm talking about the middle level cities. Some of the big cities somehow have got slightly better leverage. But as far as the general urban centers are concerned, municipalities, corporations, they have to take permission. If they want to even revise the existing taxes, if they want to put new taxes, they will again have to take permission. And the freedom that they have to tap the global capital market is also restrained by very many institutions. That I entirely share that concern, and that has to go. And that's why how we talked about 74th constitutional amendment. But having said that, I don't think we can expect that the engine should decide the destination. The engine can't decide where to go, how to go. I mean, it depends on the need of the passengers and the goods traffic. So, to say that the cities should be like the ancient city states, they should care only about the well being of the people living in the cities, they have a national responsibility. The large cities of the developing countries must be within the framework of national development. You can't say that, well, Delhi, Bombay should talk about the Delhi, Bombay people, that they can best do by restricting migration, which many of the cities, by the way, are doing. You know, I don't think that is the perspective of regional development. The cities will have to take the responsibility of national development and regional development into account, but at the same time, as far as the management and governance is concerned, and also revising the taxes, there has to be flexibility. There has to be local knowledge coming in. The central government cannot decide that, but central government certainly would decide the overall framework within which the cities have to function. And that's why I do believe there is a need for regional plans.
So, if we look at, because we say that charity begins at home, when cities are deciding for themselves, they also look means listening to their citizens, the residents living in that particular city. I'm not saying that you stop migrants from coming in like China did with hukou system and all they did. But when the cities are taking decisions, like I will just give you one example, because smart cities mission was developed, and then they were asked SPVs to implement it. They took the point of view of citizens. They had some local surveys, and then they made their smart city plans. So, do you think that citizens' point of view in decision making process, especially that is the purpose of the local government? So, do you think that 74th Amendment brought these kind of changes where citizens are engaged in decision making?
To an extent, you are right that the participation of the local population certainly has increased. And you do find that the city governments are trying to address the needs of the local people, the people who are going to vote you to power. Certainly, much more than other things. Given, for example, the cities, the smaller states which have where the large cities account for much of the total output, there is a huge subsidy culture. The local government wants to give subsidies, to just for the comfort of the own people. So, well, that has a problem with the national development process. There are implications for cost recovery in the other sectors. Why cities? You find during COVID period, large number of states, I have analyzed particularly 14 states, including Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, even Madhya Pradesh, they have passed resolutions or ordinances and proposing legislations to see that the migrants from the other states don't get the jobs at the lower level. Even for the private sector, many of the states have said, we would like you to employ the local people, which to some extent I can understand for a backward state, but that certainly disintegrates or fractures the labor market in the country. It really restricts the migration from the large cities. I understand that they have to cater to their needs, but many of these cities don't care about their peripheries. There is a degenerated peripheralization, Abhishek, because the cities don't want to include the peripheral areas within their boundaries, and they are the people who have high infant mortality rate, poor health condition, poor educational condition, right in the periphery of the large cities, which have much higher level quality of life. So I have a feeling that there is a regional planning content which has to be there, and while cities should have the liberty and the responsibility of catering to their own population, the regional responsibility cannot be given up.
Sir, you mentioned about migration and the problems migrants face during the pandemic. So, are we building exclusionary cities? And what is your opinion on to handle the problems that migration faced if such situations, God forbid, but if such situation arises again? So, do we have any policy solution to that kind of urban development?
You see, given the differences in the growth rate of labor force across regions, also the significant differences that we see in the total fertility rate, the need for migration would be very much there in the coming decades. But at the same time, the governments at the state level, even to some extent at the city level, would like to really gain the confidence and the popularity within the state. So they would like to ensure that the migrants do not come in large numbers. And as I was mentioning, during the pandemic time, number of states brought in restrictions on labor in migration, and also specifically reserving jobs at the lowest level, even at the middle level, for the local population. I have a feeling there has to be a national policy, because India is growing an uneven manner, and population growth rate in labor force is also very unequal. So there has to be a national policy really restricting such legislations or ordinances, or at the city level some facility will be given, regularization will be made only for those who have come from this state or before this date. That, I have a feeling, is going to be detrimental for overall inclusive growth of the country, and that has to be addressed. But at the same time, what you are asking me, that cities have not treated the migrants properly, and they have gone back saying we will not come back perhaps to the cities, but the rural conditions are so much worse in terms of wages, also living condition, and they have to send their remittances. They all came back without much improvement in the condition of the migrant workers. That is something a major worry, and I do believe that the state government should ensure that the Migrant Labour Act and other provisions for the migrants are strictly enforced, so that the migrants who contribute so significantly to the growth of the city, they get at least their minimum reward, and they should feel comfortable. There should be portability of all those benefits which they were entitled. They should be able to get their ration, access to health facilities, educational facilities for the children. Unless that is done, I have a feeling that this unequal development would be really unjust for the migrant workers.
When we know that these migrants are bound to come to cities, do we have affordable housing facilities for them in cities? Because in many countries like in Singapore or other places, those developed countries, they have affordable housing facilities for temporary housing facilities for people those are coming to work in cities.
Shashak, you're absolutely right. It is not only the relatively developed countries like Singapore or in Southeast Asia, even in Africa. In South Africa, when the migrants come, there is a place where they can squat, they can build something, there's a minimum facilities. And housing is a right in the constitution there. Whereas we don't have right to housing in India, is a far-fetched dream. And as far as there are various schemes that we have, including Prime Minister's Awas Yojana. The share of the migrants in that is very little. Migrants would not be able to, really enter the program. And in fact, we do find that even the targeting under Prime Minister's Awas Yojana to the poorest sections have been diluted because of relaxation of very many conditions. The plot size, the maximum income that should be there, and the loan amount which is to be sanctioned, which was much less. Now, in order to see that the middle class get the facilities and there is a success, because there are no takers, because the poorest people don't have the affordability. So, the under Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, you do find that various norms have been relaxed so that middle class people can come in and the program becomes a success. So, program is success, Prime Minister Awas Yojana, because the total housing stock has been built. 11 million they said in the urban areas, and I think they will come up. Mr. Puri did a tremendous job in starting this housing and also getting them completed. But whether these houses which have been built, which are primarily for the houseless population, will they really go to the houseless population or to the middle class? Or will that, at the national level, Abhishek, you would not believe there is no housing shortage in India. There are no, there is no housing shortage because 11 million houses are vacant. And you have a shortage of slightly higher magnitude.
Is it the issue of affordability?
Exactly. Like food. India is self-sufficient in food from 1983 onwards, but still people are hungry because of affordability. Similarly, in housing, you build 11 million houses under Prime Minister's Awas Yojana in the urban areas. It's a great thing. But if that 11 million, half of it is going to add to the vacant housing stock, then we have failed in our mission. Just producing total dwelling units as promised is not the only thing. Whether we are able to direct that to the poorest section, and that is something where we should be concerned about.
Talking about the inclusive urban development, I will quote, you wrote an article in 2003, 20 years ago, in EPW, I guess. The process of urbanization has also become exclusionary in nature, as only a few large cities with a strong economic base are able to raise resources for development, leaving out small and medium towns. You have mentioned this in your paper, Urbanization and Urban Governance, Search for a Perspective Beyond Neoliberalism, in 2003. Can you elaborate on this? What do you mean?
You see, this neoliberalism in a way allowed the large cities generally, in fact all the cities, to be independent and mobilize resources on your own, and to some extent give some freedom in terms of taxation. Now we know for sure that the large cities, I'm talking about million plus cities, and also many of them 1 lakh plus cities, which is class 1 cities, have a stronger economic base. They can tax the economic base, manufacturing, high valued services, and also high income households are there in the large cities which can be taxed. As far as small towns are concerned, there is not much of industry to tax, not much of service sector, and also people's average income is less. Number one. Number two, small towns are not able to attract private capital because it is not profitable for the private investment to come to the small towns. Also, mobilizing capital market through bonds, debentures, tapping the capital market is much easier for the large cities. They can create special purpose vehicles and get that money. The smaller towns are not getting it. So this neoliberalism, certainly by giving that kind of a liberty to an extent has allowed the large cities to corner much of the capital market and also are able to pressurize the government to have programs for them. You have JNN, you have smart cities, you have, Amrit, and they are all at the higher level. I would think that the government should think about smart villages, smart small towns, so that you create, let's say, 3,000, small towns, which are quite efficient. Similarly, large villages should be able to, retain their population, have economic activities. I think the thrust has to be, and to an extent, as far as I can read the Niti Aayog's different documents, is towards more spatially balanced and inclusive development, which needs to be promoted in order to accelerate the growth rate of urban population.
Okay, talking about because you are talking that how we should look at the small towns and we should promote them. There is a I think strategic intent released in 2020 on National Urban Policy Framework. What is your point of view on this document?
In fact, Abhishek, I must tell you, I'm very uncomfortable with this question, and you should ask this question to somebody else also. Because as far my reading is concerned, I looked at the Urban Policy Framework 2022 brought out by the ministry, and I find all the good things that you can talk about cities are there. Inclusive urbanization, sustainable urbanization, environment conservation, high level of technology, integrated planning, everything is there, And I did not get a clear roadmap. It's like Nostradamus predictions, that you can get any conclusion out of it. I personally request the policymakers to make an urban policy framework which is more explicit, clear, and doesn't have ambiguity. You don't make only such jargons which can be interpreted by different cities and states in a different manner. So I would think that some more work needs to be done in really bringing out the national urban policy framework in a clear, distinct, and unambiguous manner, which can suggest a roadmap for future development.
Okay. Talking about the urban policies that India, I think you were NIA director in '83, and in '86, Rajiv Gandhi announced it National Urban Commission, led by Charles Correa and M.N. Bush. So after that, what happened in urban policy making post 1986? I think India started taking urban areas seriously. What happened? Can you just?
No, you are right. And in fact, Charles Correa was heading that commission. And well, there was concern about promoting urbanization. And one major thing which emerged is infrastructural deficiency in large cities. And that they thought that if these cities have to attract the global capital, their infrastructure base has to be strengthened. India Infrastructure Report also came in, which talked about strengthening the capabilities of the large cities. So, to some extent, that did help. But you remember in National Commission's report, they are talking about gems, growth centers, a large number of growth centers should be promoted. The thrust, of course, was there to the large cities creating infrastructural base. But the other idea, creating, growth centers all around the country, that was not taken seriously. And I think that's the reason why you find that the urban growth rate need not accelerate. And in fact, as I mentioned, 2011 census would have shown a lower growth rate than 91, 2001, but for the fact that large number of villages were identified as urban, partly because of census activism.
Talking about census, and our census is delayed now by, I think,
You don't know
couple
when
of years
exactly
now.
it will start, and then it will take about a year for the results to come.
The problem is that why I'm mentioning this, that it is going to affect municipal access to finance? Because based on the Finance Commission report, it depends on the number of people living in your city. So, what strategy you suggest to municipalities that they can access these funds?
I think this is a very, very important concern that you are sharing in the national media, because if you don't have the population figures, many of your programs are being prepared in a suboptimal manner. You are not able to target properly. You are not to make perhaps even just allocation because you don't know the population figures. And as I said, the decade 2001 and 2021 has been a disaster for the health. Of course, we know that, but also disaster for the economy, at least for 2 years, and disaster for the data system. We are not able to have even proper NSS rounds. We don't know what is the poverty level from the official government system. Population also we do not know. But now what should be done? Because your resource allocation and many of the governmental programs depend on at least population of different cities. We should know that. I was advisor to the Sri Lankan government, and what we did, that we estimated the population of different cities through satellite images. You get the built up areas of different colors and reflect different kind of a density. So we can always get a satellite image, and based on the different categories of built up areas, you classify them into 15, 20 categories, and for each category of built up area, you have the density figure estimated from the past data or through survey. What I am saying is that get a satellite image of the built up area in and around the cities, and then you take the density figures and multiply by the built up area. If the per acre density is this and total area is this, that is the figure, and thereby you can estimate a workable and very reasonable. I mean, we did it for Sri Lanka, very reasonable estimates come out, and census can further then strengthen that. But nonetheless, I do believe that not having the data for the urban centers in India, even after 3-4 years of the scheduled date, is a matter of serious policy concern, and something needs to be done about it.
So, there is an additional question relating to census. Do you think, because in 2011 you said that number of census town increased significantly, do you think our census methodology need a relook and some new component should be introduced based on many other factors, that climate change, we can say? Why I'm saying, because there are many, because of climate change, migration is happening. So do you think it needs a relook?
No, you are right that the criteria for identifying a town, a census town is identified based on density, based on non-agricultural workforce, and also the total size, right? And there is something called statutory towns. Statutory towns are those towns which the Urban Development Department of the state government declares. Now, in India, we have total number of towns, urban centers as 7,000 plus. But out of that, something like 3,500 towns are census towns. They have been declared urban by the Registrar General of India, Census of India, but the government doesn't recognize. The Central Minister for Urban Development says this program is for urban development, but it pertains only to the statutory towns. That, I think, is a drawback. I think if the census has classified as urban, the central government should extend many of their programs to the census town. Secondly, I want to tell you, at least 26% of the Indian urban population is living under rural governance.
Yeah, that is very important.
Many of the villages which have got urban characteristics are having gram panchayat. They really deserve to have an urban local body. And many of the urban centers identified as urban by the census is not recognized by the government. So the governance system is rural. That is also coming in the way of our speedy urbanization. So I agree that newer factors of climate change, there are serious risk factors coming in. They should also be taken into consideration in identification of urban areas, those which are more vulnerable and requires intervention at a higher level. What you are saying is that do we need to relook at the criteria? I think that is important. You look at the critical areas of concern and see what kind of interventions are needed. And if for that you have to change the definition of urban centers, I think that needs to be done.
Talking about the governance issues of cities, at present, what do you think? What are the major challenges that our cities are facing right now? Because there is a challenge of climate change, there is a disasters are happening, and there is a climate-induced migration. So, what are the major challenges do you see for Indian cities in coming decades?
I find the major challenge is that of inequality within the urban areas. You see, inequality in access to employment, access to basic amenities, percentage of people who do not have drinking water facility, particularly in the middle level towns. 50,000 to 1 lakh is very high. Smaller towns have a very high deficiency. So, inequality in access to education, access to employment, access to health facilities and basic services is something that needs to be addressed, and the present system of governance is not able to do that. I'll tell you, there is a demand that ward levels also should have the right to organize water supply, sanitation, the local needs. And big cities think, like Delhi, that why should the affluent areas take the burden of the poorer areas? They don't want to pay their taxes. I think that would be a very wrong thing, to divide a big city into 5 parts, and depending on the affordability, the smaller size should provide the facilities. There has to be some minimum norm for the urban centers, and that has to be ensured. And if you do find that certain localities, certain wards or certain areas, the people are poor and they are not able to pay for the minimum cost of the services, government has to come in, because the health hazard that you talked about, that affect the whole city. It may emanate in the slum areas, but the entire city population gets affected. So the responsibility of ensuring the minimum level of water supply, sanitation facilities should be that of the overall city government, and not the ward committees, or dividing the city into 4 or 5 parts and then justifying the unequal access in terms of the paying capacity of the people is certainly not desirable.
When we talk about inequality and in cities especially, then we look at slums. That slums and that's in India and Indian cities, for example, Mumbai, more than 50% people are living in slums. You were part of the committee to develop a slum index at the city, state, and national levels. You also wrote an article on this, making Indian cities slum free, and talked about how schemes in operation lack a reliable framework for identifying non tenable slums and legitimate slum households that are entitled to get dwelling units. What are the challenges of making Indian cities slum free?
You see, I remember for Millennium Development Goals, Indian Ministry of Urban Development was reporting what is our progress towards the objective of slum improvement. And do you know what was the government of India's reply? It was such an embarrassment. The reply was, we don't have the data to even estimate how much progress we have made, which was an embarrassment. And it is indeed true that the slum data in India was being collected up to 2001 just on the basis of the reporting of the municipal corporations, and they had no standard definition. And the Registrar General of India is traveling through many cities in Madhya Pradesh, Durg, and he says, oh, I saw many slums. Registrar General says, I saw many slums, but Durg municipality has said 0. So that was the state of affairs, because slum data was given by the municipal corporation depending on their perception.
And that was notified, non-notified.
That was also depending on the notification scheme. Some cities may have a better system of notification. So the slum data was not comparable. In 2001, for the first time, census organized the data collection. But what they did, they left out class 4, class 5, class 6 towns, so slum data was not complete. In 2011, they left out the census towns, non-statutory towns were left out. So the data was not adequate, and that is the reason why what happened, because information base is inadequate. The slum development programs resulted in slum eviction. Do you know percentage of people living in slums in India went down basically because of slum clearance programs? Imagine, from 26% it went down to 19%. So that is basically because between this is 2001 and 2011. Whereas Pranab Sen committee had said that 60 million slum dwellers will become 92 million. Actually, from 60 million, it became 65 million. So total number went up, but the percentage wise it came down. And that is something which is really worrying, because the moment you want to take the slum development programs, for example, under Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, the first vertical is in situ slum upgradation, ISSU. And it was proposed that the government will build 80% of the houses for the slum dwellers, in situ upgradation. But do you know, in reality, not even 10% of the under Prime Minister's Awas Yojana is from slums. This is coming under beneficiary-led housing and this, subsidized interest house. There are 4 components. So basically, I am saying that tenable slums have to be identified. What is a tenable slum and untenable slum? Untenable slums are those which are environmentally sensitive, which are dangerous, risky for the slum dweller. Train is passing by or slump area, there are health problems, and or heritage side. But actually what happens, that anybody says, this is a railway land, or we have a plan, it becomes non-tenable. That is something which has to be avoided. You have to say, if you have not built for 20 years, if it is not an environmentally sensitive area, not health hazard, then it has to be a tenable slum. And that's the only way you can really make in situ slum upgradation successful, because local government cannot deal with the legal problems with railways, municipalities. It has to be done by the central government, so that all these slums which are not in environmentally sensitive areas or has a heritage site should be declared as tenable, and slum improvement program should be implemented there.
Sir, are there any successful models of slum redevelopment in India?
You see, in the 70s, the whole idea started that community participation based slum improvement should take place. Government will provide the infrastructural support and, if necessary, some basis for the housing units. But there will be incremental housing. The slum dwellers, on the basis of availability of the concessional funds, they should rebuild. That worked quite well, but that works in the small and medium towns only. In the large cities where you have to build vertical structures, 3 stories, 5 stories, 10 stories, it becomes very difficult. There, I know of some instances. One of them is that of Spark in Bombay, for example. They have a massive community mobilization. They have saving societies, and then they get them into housing, so that there is a group formed before the slum dwellers shift to the areas, but there is a place where they are shifted when the houses are being built. There are multi-storied structures. The laborers, the slum dwellers contribute their labor also, and that has been reasonably successful, because the slum dwellers form an organization after they shift into the multi-storied buildings for management of the basic services. So basically, I would think that for the large cities, if you want to have slum rehabilitation, you cannot leave it totally to the community. Community participation has to be a major part, but state's engagement should also be there in a significant manner. And I must tell you, Prime Minister's Awas Yojana, in situ slum upgradation program, has that component. The state participation, private sector participation, plus community engagement. But unfortunately, because land was not available, land was not given, tenable land, they said everybody who owned the land, railways, municipalities, all the public bodies, all lands under dispute, that was not given. And that's why in situ slum upgradation program, instead of claiming 80% of the dwelling units, are claiming less than 10%. That is unfortunate.
Okay, now coming to the question of master planning, model of urban development. Many of our cities in India, I think majority, I was reading somewhere 50, 55%, 60% cities do not have master plan. What is your comment on this over this kind of development in our cities?
You see, many of the small towns don't have the capability to prepare their master plan. They don't have the resources. So, town and country planning department of each state is supposed to provide them some assistance so that they can design or prepare their master plan for them if requested. But Abhishek, more important than the master plan not being there, this where no master plan is there, it is remembered more for violation than for compliance. You see, generally, master plans have been there on the board of the chief town planner, but you find that, it is hardly the city which emerges, which is hardly similar to what was being planned. Partly because there has been less of flexibility. You can't have a deterministic physical plan and expect every people to behave in terms of their investment in the residential area or commercial area. They don't follow that. I'll tell you one interesting case. I was in Paris, and the mayor of Paris city took me round to show. And there is an area called Marnala Valley around Paris. That's where the this program is there. Disneyland has come up, the American Disneyland. So he took me to an industrial area, and I asked him a foolish question. I said, "What percentage of the units are residential here?" He was surprised. He said, "This is an industrial zone. How can there be a residential unit here?" I said, "Really?" He said, "In India it happens." I said, "I know you do find that." In a capitalist country, they had a master plan, and which means something. I'm in agreement with the people who say master plan has failed in a way because physical things cannot dictate. But that does not mean that we should bid goodbye to master plan. There has to be a master plan with certain degree of flexibility and provide an overall perspective. Connect the city with the country. Their responsibility that the city has towards the country, towards the population of the nation, has to be conveyed through that master planning framework. So I personally believe in a much more modified manner, master plans would have to come in, and as you said, small and medium towns, they have to be supported by the state level town planning departments in the context of their preparation of the vision document and the planning.
I will just ask one more question. What is your point of view in Delhi master plan and Mumbai master plan, the recent released master plans of these two big cities?
I have heard about Mumbai master plan, but I'm really not confident to make a comment in a public media. But certainly, Delhi master plans have been criticized a lot more in the media, basically because of not allowing the desired flexibility and gross violations in different areas, and regularization of slums before the elections, that has happened rampantly. The payment which they were supposed to be made and the provision of the basic services were not made. So all that created serious environmental issues for Delhi population as a whole.
Now, coming to the last question of this interview, and on a lighter note, I would like to know, because we are talking about urban development and how we have made our cities, which is your favorite city?
Ah, that's a good question. You see, Abhishek, I believe that people like us, we don't live in cities. We live in localities. We live in communities. I care how the safety, water supply situation here, sanitation here, security here. And I want to know if I want to travel to a nice cinema complex, shopping place, how much time does it take, airport accessibility, sometimes railway station, that these are the things that the elite class, after all, we also, have very limited interaction with the city. What is the percentage of slum population? What percentage of Delhi population don't have access to drinking water and sanitation is hardly of any relevance to any city dweller, because he lives in his own community. But since you asked this question, I would say I'm quite happy living in Delhi, honestly. You know, Ghalib is the famous line. He says, रहेंगे माना कि रहेंगे दिल्ली में मगर खाएंगे क्या. So he was thinking that food supply was coming from other states. But I think that one problem in Delhi is रहेंगे दिल्ली में मगर सांस कैसे लेंगे. ये environmental problem है, transport का है, ये एक problem है. Otherwise, Delhi is a reasonable city to live. But I wouldn't recommend my other friends to really come in unless they have a lot of money, because Bahadur Shah Zafar said that he needed 2 गज जमीन भी ना मिली कुए यार में दिल्ली में, 2 गज जमीन मिलती है 70,000 में. So it's very expensive, particularly in low income areas. So I think the Delhi land has to be regulated properly so that certain areas become affordable. But nonetheless, I have really no complaint with this city. Excepting sometimes you have a serious law and order issue, but that happens in other places also. Delhi gets into prominence. If something happens in Delhi, then it is flashed.
I think there are two kinds of people in India, especially whom I interacted with, and one person who likes Delhi and another person who loves Mumbai. And there are two sections, and you will read in many places. I think there was an issue of an open magazine, and it was on the same issue. The people wrote about Delhi and people wrote about Mumbai.
No, you are right. In fact, I must tell you, I lived for about 2 years in a low-income area in Delhi. I enjoyed the community there. The interactions were intense, much better than in an elite area like Basant Vihar. Honestly, interactions in the low-income areas are very good.
Community is very strong in low-income areas.
But since you are comparing Bombay and Delhi, I know somebody told me that in Bombay, people's importance depend on what you are and who you are. In Delhi, people's importance depends on whom you know in the government.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time, and it was really nice talking to you and knowing about the nuances of urban development, how our cities are growing, what are the misconceptions. You really demystify many concepts and clarify for our audience, for us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.